topic is a May 2017 referendum to change the Australian Constitution to recognise Australia's First Peoples. What's happening with that? So we have two really great speakers tonight. The first one will be Mark Yettica-Paulson. He's an Indigenous man from southeast Queensland and northeast New South Wales region. He's here tonight as an ambassador for the Recognise campaign. He's a founder and director of the Yettica Group, specialising in facilitating Indigenous leadership and assisting groups to work better as Indigenous and other Australians. Mark has had several years' experience in leadership management, consulting, community education, leadership training, church and community organising and youth work. His facilitation work has been with several organisations including the National Australia Bank, the Australian Football League, Medibank, Social Leadership Australia, Desert Knowledge Australia, Australia Post, Foundation for Young Australians, Reconciliation Australia and the AFL Players Association. He also assisted organisations in their reconciliation action plans, including the NAB, Australia Post, Medibank and the Richmond Football Club. He's an associate with Rios Partners and Social Leadership Australia, and you can see his employment history across a range of sectors has crafted a unique skill set and wealth of experience. In 2009, he was recognised by The Australian as being one of the top 100 emerging leaders in Australia. In 2011, Mark won the title of Best Public Speaker in Australia on Strictly Speaking, a public speaking television show on ABC One. It's going to be great tonight. Our second speaker this evening is Sylvie Elsmore. She's a native title lawyer, and there's a lot of formalies here. Former Executive Officer of New South Wales Reconciliation Council, former board member of ANTA New South Wales, former policy coordinator, New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, former Greens Councillor or Marrickville Council, which doesn't exist at the moment. And for many years, Sylvie co-convened the Reconciliation Youth Network. She's a great activist and really engaged in this topic. I now invite our first speaker to the microphone, so please welcome Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you tonight. I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this place, of this land, and acknowledge that I'm a visitor to this place. My country is further north, and my peoples, we live around Brisbane, but we're all in the southeast corner in the north part of New South Wales. Where my family traditionally come from, further up in Queensland, and but because we have family on both sides of the border, New South Wales and Queensland, always state of origin is a really hard time for our families. But as long as you don't mention it, then we all get along just fine. I've had the privilege of living and working in this beautiful city before. I know Sylvie and Ben from the good old days when we were younger and faster, and I was much slimmer back then. But it's also a reminder that when you have an inclination for social justice, it means that you bump into each other when there's matters of social justice and important conversations about our country and our future. And it was only a matter of time before I bumped into these two, and it's fantastic that that's happened. I want to acknowledge there's some fellow recognised people who have come up here to support us as well. They are not wearing the R shirt, it's just me tonight, but they're here incognito, but they are here. Thank you for coming, thanks. This movement for constitutional recognition has been around for a while. Many decades ago, people began conversations about how do we get proper recognition of the First Peoples here? How do we do this? How do we wrestle with this very important and fundamental truth that this land wasn't settled on justice principles? It wasn't settled legally, properly. And because of that, we've got this ongoing issue that needs to be sorted. And that's the relationship between the First Peoples and the rest of us as Australians. How do we do this properly? As early as 1938, we know that the kind of movements around a national day of mourning, to not commemorate January 26th, but to name it as a national day of mourning, that those practitioners, those campaigners back then, they were appealing for the kind of citizenship and equality of citizenship that was afforded to the rest of Australians. And so as early as then, the idea about you need to change the constitution in order to have citizenship for its First Peoples, that was as early as 1938. But you and I both know that the world has changed a great deal since 1938. And we're now in a situation where how do we rectify, or how do we begin to set right a relationship, knowing that we can't reverse settlement, knowing that we can't begin a process of deoccupation? How do we set right the relationship? How do we begin to do that? And the kind of work that I have done historically with Ben and Sylvia around reconciliation, the decades of reconciliation movement has been an attempt to try and do that, to try and educate more and more of us as Australians to set this right. During that period of reconciliation, there's a very important stepping stone towards that, and that was towards the end of the 70s and throughout the 80s. And that stepping stone was around the idea about putting a treaty instrument into place. And the closest we've got to having a framework and instituted agreement making on a national treaty was in 1979, 1980. I want to fast forward from there through to the decade of reconciliation, and in the middle of that decade, 1995, there was an ATSIC report which talked about the kind of rights protection and recognition. And in that, one of the recommendations was that there ought to be constitutional recognition, that there ought to be changes made to the Constitution. So this is not a brand new thing. This is not something that's been dreamt up in the last little while. The modern movement of constitutional recognition that you and I now know to be like the recognised movement, or the ConRec stuff now, this stuff began in 2010. Really the push for the work that we are doing began when an expert panel was empowered by the Gillard government to go and say, look, this thing has been around for a while. Let's see if there is an appetite out there in the Australian public to do this. Is there an appetite to have constitutional recognition? And what this expert panel found through hundreds of community meetings and thousands of submissions, they found that yes, there is an appetite to do this. However, you can't recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that they were here first and still retain the power to discriminate in the Constitution. You can't on the one hand say, we want to acknowledge your peoples, that your peoples were here, you still are here, and we want to acknowledge that fact, but we still retain the power to discriminate on the basis of race. They said if we're going to do this, we need to do and fix both of those things. So racism out and recognition in. That was the kind of thing that they needed to do. However, there was a significant stumbling block. Half of Australians didn't even know about our Constitution. Half of Australians could not even tell you what was in our Constitution. And for anyone who's caught any of the American popular culture of the last 25 years, we can quote more about the American Constitution than we can about Australia's Constitution. People can talk about a Fifth Amendment and the right to bear arms and things like that, and you ask them, well, what's any section of the Australian Constitution? And they're like, it's got something about the Queen, I think, and something about the Commonwealth and the States. But so what we found is that half Australians didn't even know about the Constitution, and then you put the further layer of not having an adequate understanding of the history of this country. And so they said, we need some sort of a movement that will raise awareness and support for this idea. And to do that, they need to go out and they need to speak to the whole of the country, and to share with the whole of the country that there is a need to recognise the First Peoples. There is also a need to correct racial discrimination that was put into a document that was made enshrined into the Constitution because of the way people thought back in the 1890s. The country is different now. We are different people. We need to have that reflected in our Constitution. So Recognise began its work to raise awareness and support for the idea that there would be proper recognition of the First Peoples and that there would be removal of racism in the Australian Constitution. We don't write the model, we don't have an idea about what the model looks like. The pathway for us is we go by what the expert panel has put together, and they've got a number of suggestions about what it might look like. There was also a joint parliamentary select committee which was headed by Ken Wyatt, Indigenous man from Western Australia, in the House of Reps. He headed this up, as well as Senator Nova Peris when she was a senator. She was also heading this joint parliamentary select committee. They also tested the idea, what could this look like? And they came up with some suggestions about what this might look like. But those suggestions have been put forward now, and now the process remains with a referendum council, which is 16 eminent Australians. So 16 of them, half of them, 8 of them are Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. The other half are the other Australians. And that group of 16 are now in a process of consultation and of being able to work through what the model will look like. They have the very difficult and sensitive task of getting the words right. Words that will be strong enough so that it's worth doing. Strong enough because it will recognise and it will put in proper recognition of the First Peoples, but also it has to be general enough so that Joe average public can also pick it up. So we could put that to everyone else downstairs and say, is this a reasonable proposition? And they'd go, oh yeah, it's not too bad, and then take another sip of whatever they're sipping downstairs. This is a difficult task. We know that referendums in Australia, they are difficult to move. There have been 44 times that the idea to put to the public, these are changes we want to make. Only 8 times has it ever changed. 8 times in the history of this document has it changed. One of those changes was absolutely significant, was in 1967. That is the highest ever yes vote that's been recorded. 9 out of 10 people voted in yes in favour to have what they believed at that time would be a platform for equal rights for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In that 1967 referendum, the removal of the section that said don't count Aborigines when you count your census, that was crossed out. That was section 127 of the Australian Constitution. The other part that was crossed out is in the long list of powers for the Commonwealth in section 51. You run down that list and it says, oh look, the Commonwealth has to look after taxation and defence, and they also have to look after buoys and lighthouses. And the Commonwealth, section 51.26, you'd know this, I know. That section, it talks about how the Commonwealth can make special laws for any race. Now, before 1967, it said the Commonwealth can make special laws for any race except Aborigines. That part was crossed out after 67, and it's like, let's get a more equal platform for making laws for people of any race in this country, and we need to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we need to count them in the census. You will find people will argue the merit, benefit, or otherwise of 1967. Some people see it as you only counted us so that you could make laws for us and oppress us. Other people say that was actually a platform for the whole country to start getting serious about how we live together. Whichever way you want to look at it, 67 remains our highest ever yes vote. 9 out of 10 people voted in favour for that. What we are sincerely hoping is that as we look towards the end of this year, the Referendum Council will put to Parliament the words that they think will be strong enough and general enough for us to go to the vote on. The idea that we might be able to vote on the 27th of May next year remains one of the sincere positions of the government. Now, truth be told, there's lots of difficult things that have to fall into place. That's really crunching through a lot of processes. However, we will face the 1967 anniversary. We will face that next year. On the 27th of May 2017, it's exactly 50 years to the day, and it is a Saturday. If you are an AFL fan, That's also dream time at the G. But I know that we're here in New South Wales, so you're probably like, yeah, well, whatever. But what this means is that we will hit a moral point next year where we will say, what are we doing with this? 50 years ago, 9 out of 10 of us voted that we would have a better platform for our relationship together. 50 years on, where are we now? And so I hope that either we are voting in the referendum on that day, or that we will take a very, very close look at ourselves and we will say, if we don't do this referendum in a minute, in a week, in a month, in 3 months, if we don't do it now this year, 2017, it will not give us the momentum that we need to move forward. If we don't pursue this next year, it will have the likelihood of drifting into another generation, or drifting even just further along where we say, no, we need to get it more right, we need to get it more correct. That word could be changed if we made it a little bit more sweeter or a little bit more general. Oh no, that word we need to make more strong. We will argue and argue for many, many years unless we get to the point of saying this will work to help us make progress, move forward together. The work of Recognise is to not write that. The work of Recognise is to continue to go out to forums like this. We have travelled around the country 38,000 kilometres as we have gone to hundreds of communities, and we've spoken to somewhere near 28,000 people face to face to talk about what this process is. We are not the ones writing it, but we're raising awareness and support because we believe that we need a constitution, Australia needs a constitution that recognises its First Peoples and no longer gives the Commonwealth or state governments power to discriminate on the basis of race. So that's the idea, that's where the movement is at the moment. We are watching very carefully the work of the Referendum Council, and as they move around the country and have their consultation processes, there's always a little bit of media frenzy around that, and people will ask significant questions. We do know that there are conversations that are happening right now that include treaty conversations, that also include people who are declaring their own forms of sovereignty and trying to make arrangements around that. We know that those things are happening. This work will not stop any movement or any progression of any treaty conversation. The current proposals as they sit don't stop any movement for treaty, they don't stop any movement for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people expressing and declaring their sovereignty. But what this will do for you and I as Australians, what this does do for us, it gives us an opportunity to say, from this moment on, we set the relationship in this direction. So that you and I as Australians, I hold an Australian passport. And what that means is that you and I as Australians, what we get to say is that 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 7 out of 10, I sincerely hope it's in those high numbers and we don't get 4.5 out of 10 or 6.2 out of 10. It'll be a bit like our election, wouldn't it? It's like, yeah, oh, who's won? Oh, okay, let's just wait for a little bit longer. We didn't know. We don't want that when we do this referendum. We want to be able to say very clearly that we as a nation want to remove racism, and we want to acknowledge and respect and put proper recognition of our First Peoples. That's our hope, and that's why we're here tonight, to have that conversation. Thank you.